Hello everyone, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here, and today we're going to look at some basic endgames with the king and pawn versus a lone king, and we're going to discover how the rook pawn often leads to a draw. So let's take a look at that. The first thing we want to take a look at is just a normal position in the middle of the board, and white is going to play to win here. So we can see that if the white king tries to step to the side, trying to lay claim to the queening square, that all black has to do is stay in front of the king. And white can try the other side for the other queening square, and unfortunately black can simply stay in front. This means that white is going to have to move the pawn. Black tries to stay in front, again trying to prevent the pawn from queening, and white can simply move the pawn here. And what we notice is that the pawn is covering both sides, the king is covering this side, and black's king does have a square available to move, so this is not a draw. Black has to move out of the way, and then white's king can claim the queening square, which allows it to protect the pawn and where it's going to queen. Black has no choice here, the queen is going to happen. So let's move on to what it looks like, however, when we have a rook pawn, meaning the pawns that start in front of their rooks either on the H file or the A file. And the idea here is that black's king wants to get in the corner and blockade this pawn from making any progress. And so white tries to move out. Again, we're trying to claim this queening square, but now it's easy for black. Black can just stay in front. White's forced to move the pawn, and again, black stays in the corner. And from here we can see that no matter what white does, we end up having a draw or stalemate. If white simply moves the pawn, black's turn to move, not in check, no safe legal move, it's a stalemate. If we back up and make a different move here, like king to f7, then what we see is that the king can simply move toward the pawn, and the kings are separated from one another. No matter where white goes, black simply takes the pawn, and again, king versus king ends in a stalemate. So we just want to memorize this position here, that this leads to a draw because it's a rook pawn. There are no squares off the edge of the board. There is no I file, for instance. So we can see that, again, that leads to a draw, and this also leads to a draw. So what if it's not a rook pawn? We have the same setup here with the white pawn to the side, but you'll notice that there is a file over here that is available to be used. So now when white pushes the pawn, black's king actually has a space to go to. It's no longer a draw. So once black is forced to move, white claims the queening square. Black has no choice. The queen comes onto the board, and it's only a couple of moves from checkmate from here. Black is trapped against the edge of the board. White simply repositions to redirect the king. King takes the only square he can, and the kiss of death. So what's important here with a rook pawn is where the kings are positioned. At the moment, we can see that the white king already has the queening square. There's nothing black can do to stop this pawn from marching and becoming a queen. So that's a very important thing to note, is that if white already has the queening square, then white is going to win. But what if white's king is now trapped in front of the rook pawn? Instead of black's king trying to get over to the square in the corner, what we're going to do is we're going to keep white's king in front, because as you can see, the white king is stuck against the edge of the board because of the black king. So this is a very important thing to see. What is white to do here? It doesn't matter which way white goes. So let's take a look at that. Let's say this is the position. If it were white's turn to move, it would be simple. White would simply move over to g7, claim the queening square, and march this pawn to victory. Unfortunately for white, it's black's turn to move, and let's see how this plays out. Black positions himself to trap the white king in front of his own pawn. So white could try king to h8 here, but that allows the king just to come towards the pawn, and white's going to lose his pawn. So instead, if we try just moving the pawn to h5, well, black's going to try and reposition, because what black's trying to do is get into this corner like the previous exercise, or trap the king in front. If the king tries to step out, well, black's excited. He gets to go to the corner. And we end up in this same position that we saw before. So if we come back to a different decision, like white's king coming into h8, well, then black tries to attack the pawn, but also keeps white's king in front. So again, we keep white's king in front. White can't make any progress here and eventually has to move the pawn. And with this move, it's a stalemate. As you can see, the pawn can't move forward. It's blocked by the king. The king can't move to either of these squares because of black's king. Neither king is in check. This is a draw and a stalemate. So the big difference was white controlling the queening square. As we can see, white can seize it at any moment, and no matter what happens here, the pawn is going to promote. So here's the pattern you really want to memorize. X marks the spot, or in this case, the red circles. If the black king can get into any of these 7 squares, if we have a black king in any of these 7 squares at any point in the exercise, it's going to lead to a draw. If black's king cannot get to any of these squares, then white's going to promote the pawn. So remember, if there's a rook pawn and you're the side without the rook pawn, you desperately want to get your king into one of these 7 squares. On the flip side, if you have the rook pawn, you need to get your king out from in front of it and don't allow your opponent's king to get into these 7 squares. If you can accomplish that, you'll get a queen and win the game. Well, I hope this rook pawn ending was helpful to you. Please subscribe to our channel for more chess basics, and visit us on Facebook and like our page for Hood County Chess Club. Until next time, I'm Zach Wilson. We'll see you again real soon.